Bom dia, pessoal. Bom dia a todos que já estão aqui conosco. Hoje é nosso último dia da Semana da Química. Estamos muito felizes pela participação de todos vocês. E hoje temos mais um dia especial, como todos os outros. Esse vai ser um dia também corrido, mas a gente conta com vocês durante toda a manhã e toda a tarde. Alguns avisos para a gente falar. Hoje, pela manhã, nós vamos ter uma palestra super interessante com o Dr. Carlos Toro, da ACS. Ele é editor, né, da ACS, editor de alguns jornais da ACS. E ele vai falar um pouco para a gente sobre publicação, né, para não nativos, para não falantes, né, da língua inglesa nativos. E à tarde nós vamos ter o show de talentos. Então, eu conto com todos vocês no show de talentos para a gente presenciar e prestigiar nossos colegas que nos mandaram vídeos. E logo em seguida, nós vamos ter a sessão de homenagens, vamos homenagear um professor e uma servidora. Em seguida, temos a premiação do professor Ícaro Moreira de Souza, o prêmio da pós-graduação. E vamos ter a palestra da professora Otília para finalizar a nossa semana da Química. E nosso quarto workshop da pós-graduação em Química. Eu quero agradecer muito a ACS, a American Chemical Society, quem foi que organizou conosco a palestra do dia de hoje. Agradecer mais uma vez a Regiane Bracht, que vai entrar conosco, ela quem vai coordenar essa nossa palestra. Estamos muito felizes. E, Regiane, bom dia. Muito obrigado em nome de todos. Mais uma vez conosco, por nos ajudar com essa palestra, fazer o convite ao Dr. Carlos Toro, e ele está aqui com a gente. Eu estou passando a palavra agora para você, e que a gente tenha aí uma palestra excelente.
Muito obrigada, Luan. Bom dia a todas e a todos. Eu quero, primeiramente, em nome da American Chemical Society, agradecer por essa oportunidade. Para a gente é uma honra, né? Pelo segundo ano consecutivo, nós temos a oportunidade de colaborar, de certa forma, com a UFC na organização da Semana da Química. Eu quero aqui agradecer a comissão organizadora, agradecer a professora Conceição, que é advisor do ACS Chapter na UFC, e agradecer a todos os membros do Chapter por essa oportunidade. Então, muito obrigada, reforçando aqui a nossa alegria em participar desse evento, mesmo em tempos tão desafiador, ter a oportunidade de estar aqui com vocês. Muito obrigada. Hoje, então, como o Luan disse, nós temos a honra de ter o Dr. Carlos Toro conosco, que é um grande especialista no assunto que nós vamos falar, né, publicação científica, comunicação científica, que é um tema tão elementar e que a gente sabe que precisa ser amplamente discutido e precisa ser objeto, né, de discussões dentro das universidades, porque a gente sempre diz que tão importante quanto fazer uma descoberta científica, né, é saber comunicar essa descoberta. Então, agora eu não vou me delongar mais, porque, evidentemente, a gente quer passar a palavra para o Dr. Carlos para que ele possa, então, proceder com a sua apresentação. Antes, porém, vou fazer uma breve introdução. Então, o Dr. Carlos Toro, ele se formou em Química pela Universidade de Zulia, na Venezuela, onde iniciou sua carreira profissional como químico computacional. Em 2010, Carlos obteve o seu pós-doutorado em Química pela University of Central Florida. Posteriormente, o Dr. Toro concluiu seu pós-doc como fellow no Departamento de Química e Bioquímica da Universidade de Maryland. Na primavera de 2014, ele ingressou na divisão de publicações da American Chemical Society e atualmente ele é editor executivo sênior, supervisionando um portfólio com 8 periódicos. E a principal responsabilidade é sobre o desenvolvimento e gestão estratégica desses periódicos. Então, eu quero agradecer. So, Carlos, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure for us having you here. And please, the word is with you.
Thank you so much, Regiani. It is an honor for me and a pleasure to to be back with this audience in this new format. I have to say that I very much enjoyed my visit. Was it, I believe, last year?
Last year, yes.
Time is now an interesting concept, but I had a great time during my visit last year. Fantastic research being done over there. Very talented group of professors and students. So, all I have to say is that I greatly appreciate the welcoming. We are all in this together. So very much enjoy the opportunity to be here with you guys today. So should I just jump in? Is that? Yep. Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So let me share my screen here. Can someone confirm, please, that you guys can see my screen? Yes?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, Reggiani. So this is probably a presentation that many of you may be familiar with. We presented this last year during our visit for during the same chemistry week and the event that was organized back then. As Reggiani said, I have been in scholarly publishing now for nearly 6 years. So I was, in grad school and as a postdoc doing the research myself. So now I have a little bit of an understanding on sort of both sides of the equation. So we spend quite a bit of time, right, in the lab doing the experiments, and it comes to a moment where we need to stop for a second and realize that we need to put this work into context. We need to let our peers know what are the findings that are coming out of this research. So when start to prepare a manuscript that is going to be sent for publication, it is important to start with a useful outline, right? And the things that we are highlighting here, they not always happen in a sequential manner. So we gather the data, right? And typically, even prior to that, before we engage in any experiment, right, there is a hypothesis that, or there is a question that we want to prove. And typically, these questions are the why, the what, and how we're going to do it, right? And that leads us to start gathering data. And it is important to start organizing this data by its relevance. It is important, again, not to put things in context chronologically, but in order of relevance. And it is this outline. It's pretty much something that is not set in stone. It's something that is constantly revised and reviewed in order to outline. As you start gathering data, maybe the data will take you in one direction or in another direction. So it is important always to take a look at this outline and adapt the writing of your manuscript accordingly. And here you have to start thinking, as you start collecting data, what are the concrete figures that will tell your message in a clear and compelling way. So all this to say that you need to start this outline as early as possible in the project and really not wait until the end. I mean, it's as everything, right? It requires planning and organization, and you want to start this process as early as possible. As you start working on the writing of the paper, prior to that step, I'm sure there's a lot of articles that you're going to read to guide your discussion, to put your specific project in context, right? So you are somewhat aware of who are the key laboratories in the world that are leading this research, who are the main contributors to this field. So you probably start seeing a pattern already on what are some of the journals your specific community publishes in. And that will probably help you then define what is the journal you want to choose to publish your work, right? It is a very kind of easy temptation to fall into, to actively pursue impact factor. Not necessarily always the journal with the highest impact factor is where your community publishes the work. I mean, you really want your work to be read by your peers. You really want to make a contribution to your specific field, and for your community to be aware of this work. So you have to choose the journal carefully, and it always depends on the nature of the project, right? If your work is really multidisciplinary and it encompasses sort of a big new idea to the field, then you may want to consider journals that are sort of much broader appeal. Think about the Journal of the American Chemical Society or ACS Central Science, right? Journals that are all encompassing in the fields of chemistry. Now, if your work is more specific to a particular community, then you may need to target that particular manuscript to the community that you're interested in reaching. So then you start kind of narrowing down the list to, is it an article specifically on analytical chemistry? Is it an article specifically on organic chemistry? Then you need to tailor your message to that specific group. It is not an easy task. And why am I saying this? Because as of 2018, according to some of the metrics available in the scholarly publishing world, there are at least, back then, we're talking about 2 years ago, something around 33,000 journals available to you, right? So it is a huge pool to choose from. So it is always important, as I said before, to consider the scope and the audience. If you take a look at any journal, and here's just an example, right? ACS Applied Materials and Interfaces. You look at the scope of the journal, you see the type of work that is being published in that journal. That should give you a relatively good sense of, is this journal interested in the type of work that I'm about to submit? And usually an easy exercise is look at the references you are planning to include in your specific article. If you don't see many papers or many citations or many references as being part of this journal, there is a very high possibility that that's not where the community is publishing. So use that tip as a way to gauge. Just look at your own list of references and see what's the most common journals you're probably going to cite. That gives you an indication that that's probably where most of the community is publishing that type of work. And again, the audience is very important, always to keep in mind. We cannot stress enough every time that we do these type of presentations that it is very tempting to pursue just impact factors, but it's not the only sort of criteria you should pay attention to. Now, you do all this work and you're actively working on writing your manuscript. and this is typically something that many authors tend to overlook. It's making sure that you read and follow the specific guidelines for that journal. And why we stress this as an important point, because we understand it very, very well. It is quite frustrating to be changing formats from one journal to the other. We do not always get published in the first journal we chose, and that's okay. I mean, it's part of the process. So the authors always have to exercise, caution, in the sense that when the paper gets submitted from one journal to the other, there's probably some formatting changes that the next journal will require. Now, we understood very early on at ACS that it is not a good service to our own authors to ask them to change so much formatting, even within our own portfolio of journals, even within ACS. If you were not accepted in one journal, you were probably required a whole different formatting for another journal, and that's very frustrating. So about 2 or 3 years ago, we implemented what it's called review ready format. So we just ask you to have the minimum things that are required for peer review, and we will ask for formatting changes when the paper it's probably moving through the acceptance process. But in any case, sometimes this is if you decide to stay within the ACS portfolio. What happens if you decide to go to another publisher, which is perfectly fine. Just always make sure that you read and follow the guidelines, because it's going to save you time and it's going to save the editors and time as well. And the idea is always to make this process as smooth and fast as possible for everyone. So what do we mean by telling a story, right? Every paper, every manuscript, every article that you read should have two things in mind. It should have a main theme and a punchline, right? What is it that you try to accomplish, and what is it that you actually accomplished, right? So this was the main idea. This was the question you were trying to answer, and here is my contribution to this specific problem. This is what you achieved. This is the problem you solved in this particular paper, right? And what do we mean by the second bullet point? Avoid data dumping. It's or what it's sometimes called as data slicing. So you want to avoid. So the paper needs to stand on its own. You need the paper to be robust in such a way that with the data, with the graphics, with the figures you are providing, there is no doubt that you are demonstrated what you claim to demonstrate in this specific article. So excessive data is not always good, but at the same time, also lack of data will go against your article in a way that there's probably not enough evidence to support your claims. And now maybe, and where I'm going with this is the fact that the paper needs to stand on its own. And it's very tempting to say, I have a lot of data, therefore I'm going to get 3 or 5 papers out of this. I think it's in your benefit to say, I might get one good paper out of it, enough data to support my claims, right? It's not about the quantity, but the quality of the work that you are presenting. And at this, it's just the way science progresses. There is probably somebody else who kind of paved the way to the work that you are presenting. So it's always good to put your work into context with prior literature. What is it that others did that helped you in this particular research? Sometimes it is also good to tackle or frame the discussion in such a way that if there is a discrepancy in the literature, you may want to shine light on that discrepancy. But it's always good to put, to acknowledge the work that it has been done prior to this time. Kind of self-explanatory, explain the importance of the problem being addressed, share experimental details that allow a reasonable educated person in your field to reperform the students and reproduce them, right? You may want to, and I'm getting a little philosophical here, but what is it that a scientist's ultimate goal is? To be recognized, to receive many awards, to be known in the community as for your contribution? Yes, all those things are excellent, but sort of making sure that the test that your publication passes the test of time. And what I mean by that is that you want to, as others paved the way to get you to this point, you also want to pave the way to future generations to develop new things and to answer new questions. So that upcoming generation, which is not probably years away, it's probably that graduate student, it's probably that postdoc who in a couple of months found your paper, found it very interesting, and want to start to say, okay, let me see if I can repeat what Carlos did in this paper. That is important. So providing enough experimental data, it's very relevant. It's key so that we can make sure that the scientific record is robust. So make sure that the data is analyzed accurately and and it's objective. Provide a conclusion that it describes the words and move the field forward, but be realistic, right? It is always good that the conclusion kind of also adds a little bit of, and this is where this work will be heading, right? You want to tell the reader where you think the conclusions and these specific results will take the field. But at the same time, you don't want to be too speculative, right? You don't want to set the wrong expectations. And as I said, just mention future potential directions for your work. This presentation is meant to be for non-native speakers, and as you may say, based on my very strong accent, also English is not my primary language. Being born in Venezuela, Spanish is my native language. So these are things that I kind of learned along the way. But as you start working on your manuscript, there are certain phrases that are relatively easy and common to use, but that really send the wrong message to the reader. And here are a few examples. Now, when you use expressions like "it has long been known," basically what that translates to is I didn't even bother to look at the reference. It is generally believed, the last sentence, maybe one or two people think that this is the case. So scientific writing is very factual and concrete, and I found this in my own writing. When I tend to write in Spanish, I tend to be very verbose. I mean, long sentences, and I tend to just add 2 or 3 or 4 sentences before my main point. Scientific writing is about, these are the facts, and you describe them just the way they are. So you probably are all familiar with this, what the anatomy of a manuscript is. So it's title, abstract, introduction, graphics, experimental section, and results and discussion. Some journals may choose to separate this plus a conclusion. In what order you do these, it kind of varies from group to group. But in my very own experience, before I put the first words in the abstract or in the introduction, I always made sure that the graphics were ready. discussing with your advisor, discussing with other authors of the group, what are the graphics that send the clear message? And I used to put them all the way all over a table and start playing with them like if it was a puzzle, just making sure that I had the graphics in the right order, and that will guide your discussion, right? Because once, as I said in one of the previous tips, you need a theme and a punchline, and the graphics, right? The figures will just tell you that. What's my story? How am I going to tell people what was my hypothesis, how I approached it, and what were the results of my research? So that kind of worked for me. I started with graphics, making sure that I had them in the right order, and then from there everything kind of flowed. Titles, you do several iterations just to make sure that you get the right title, and I'm going to speak a little bit about more titles in upcoming slides. The abstract and the conclusions, typically, they're not the same thing, right? You don't want to. So in the abstract, you want to say, kind of give the reader a taste for what the paper is all about, and really, here's when you want to make sure that the theme and the punchline are clear. I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about this, but basically, you are competing, and I'm using that word on purpose. You're pretty much competing for the reader's attention, right? And we are bombarded with information, so thousands and thousands of papers are published, probably in your own field, every year. So how do you make sure that the reader catches your work? So you want to make sure they will probably read the abstracts, look quickly at the graphics, and read the conclusion. If you catch the reader with those three elements, then there is a very good chance that they will read your paper. Oh, sorry, there was one more click there on obviously the references. And here's where I'm going to go with catching the reader's attention. As I said, they will probably read title, abstract, look at the figures, and read the conclusion. So making sure that the graphics are done with care, it's extremely, extremely important. They have to be clear and precise, yet informative. You don't wanna, make it so complex that the reader will spend just hours trying to understand what you're trying to say in this graphic. Just by quickly looking at it, the reader needs to get a good sense of what you're trying to say. In these specific examples, right? Okay, there is a cube nanoparticle. We mix them with other nanoparticles. They conglomerate, and then this other particular particle starts to melt in the corner. I mean, it's very simple. It's very visual. Here in the figure on the right, here's the pristine materials. Then here, depending on where we look at the surface, then we see different spectra. Very clear, right? In one snapshot, the reader understands what the author is trying to say. So make sure that there's a good use of color. Graphics must be original or an unpublished work created by the author. And just make sure, it happens sometimes that you want to reuse somebody else's data to support your own story. That's okay. It can be done, but make sure that you cite properly and that you have the necessary permissions to reproduce that work. And again, attract the readers with a strong title. It's pretty much the central message here. You are competing for the reader's attention. So craft a compelling title that describes the work and the findings in as few words as possible. Right? You wanna give them enough to catch their attention so that they read the full paper. And then there's avoid the use of buzzwords like for the first time, only. Those are words that the editors typically tend to disqualify right away, because you need to let the work speak for itself. Being the first one, being the only one about something, no, the quality of the work will speak for itself. And it's just this third bullet point, it kind of varies by group, but typically tend to use questions as a title. So here are a couple of examples of how to craft a good example. Look at the first example. Avoid overly long titles. Synthesis, electrochemistry, spectroscopic characterization. Is like, by the fifth word, I'm really tired. And I honestly do not want to read this paper, right? You don't need to tell me in the title every experimental technique that you used in your paper. So here it's a much, concrete article that kind of gets the read to attention. Oh, they're using lanthanum complexes to study DNA at nanomolar concentrations, right? Very simple, very simple. And then I get a sense of what they did, what the work is all about. Oh, let me read the paper to see how they did it, right? That's important. And again, you want to capture the reader attention with the TOC graphics. It stands for Table of Contact Graphics. They do count, right? They give that additional. It's an additional hook, right, to get the reader's attention. And you want to give a quick visual impression of what the work it's all about. And a tip that is important to highlight here: do not use a graphic that is already in the paper. And probably here it's not the best example to use, but using an XY plot for a TOC is not very, at least compelling to the eye. Here we can see that in the image on the left, okay, they're trying to do some green synthesis, so therefore there is, the water is the solvent medium here. There are some probably particles that get excited via the use of radiation or light. And the reader gets right away a glimpse of what the work is all about. So just keep in mind that there are three things that you have to use in your favor and fully take full advantage of in order to get the reader's attention. A compelling title. Make sure that the graphics are done properly and that you have a very attractive TOC image. There is nothing worse than graphics being done in a sloppy way, because if the figures are done in a sloppy way, what that tells the editor, what that tells the reader is, if you really didn't care in making these graphics properly, it kind of plants the thought that how much care did you put in the actual experiment. So you don't want to leave the reader with that impression, certainly. And as I usually tell my kids, practice will make you better. And kids are a perfect example of that, right? They get very frustrated when they don't get things correct the first time. It happens to us, right? Throughout our training as a scientist, we learn how to identify a problem, create an hypothesis, and create a series of experiments to solve that problem. Well, writing a paper is pretty much the same thing. You have to revise, edit, and rework, just making sure that you do that cycle several times in order to send the message that you want to send. Even professors with relatively long years of experience, they always, make sure that several people read the paper before it is sent to the journal. Who needs to read the paper? Your colleagues in the lab, other graduate students, other postdocs, make sure that your advisor reads the manuscript. And it's always, it depends. These several people approach this differently, but even another professor, another colleague of yours who has nothing to do with the research, just have them read the paper and see if they can understand what you're trying to say. This presentation is not meant to be about peer review, but you might experience that many times when you send the paper for publication and you get comments from the reviewers, the natural reaction is, well, the reviewer didn't understand what I was trying to say. There is maybe some of that, but despite the anger, despite the frustration that you have because the paper was not accepted or the editor asked for revisions, take one step back and say, could I have written this in a different way so that it's clearer to the reader what my message is, right? It is on you as an author to send a clear and concise message to the reader, to your audience, of what you are trying to accomplish with this publication. So I will reiterate this. It is important to always revise, edit, and rework several times. It is, and there are services out there. This is just a plug for an ACS service, but you can seek help from professionals that will help you with editing, translation, and formatting, if those are things that you kind of are struggling with. Something that it is typically done at the end and in a hurry, but is almost as important as the main body of the manuscript, is to prepare the supporting information with care. Some of the papers that you're working on probably took you 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of research. There is no way that you can include everything in the main body of the paper. So you have to select what are the 3 or 4 or 5 figures, whatever it is, that you will choose to go in the main paper, and what is other type of data that support the claims and the conclusions you have in the main body of the paper. That typically goes to the supporting information. And again, just to mention again this point about reproducibility of your research. There is almost a reproducibility crisis in science. There was a report published maybe a couple of years ago, I believe in Nature or Science, where they looked at reproducibility across fields, and the alarming percentage of papers that people cannot reproduce the results, after they have been published. So the supporting information, it's yet another opportunity that you have to guide the readers and provide enough context so that they can reproduce the work in the future. So just make sure that in addition to what is added to the main body of the paper, that you provide the proper context and the additional supporting information for a reader to understand in a much broader context how you reached the conclusions that you reached. And here it's once you've done, you have the paper ready to go, you need to address these to the editor of the journal, right? And it has to be a very strong cover letter. As a rule of, a cover letter should be no longer than 1 page, right? This is your opportunity to tell the editor why you think the journal is a good fit for your paper, and what is it? What's new about this work that merits, consideration for publication? So make sure that you address you have the correct title of the journal, and if the name is available, it's most journals have the name of the editor-in-chief available on the website. Make sure that you address the letter to the proper editor. you would be surprised how many times, and it happens, right? If the paper is not accepted in the first journal, you just want to move on to the next journal. But at least take the time to make sure that the names of the editors and the title of the journal is correct in your cover letter. And make sure that you include the title of the paper and why you think this work is worth consideration in that journal. Believe me, editors do pay attention to cover letters. And you have an opportunity, again, to highlight the relevance of the work. Why is this work important? And here's just, we discovered, right? I mean, we are on purpose in highlighting that word. The authors discovered, and compared to previous studies, and they say we were able to improve this activity, right? Those are keywords. Why? You have to put your work in context. Is this just, we just change a functional group in my molecule and this is what we're presenting? Well, one could argue that that's not advancing the field that much. That work, yes, it's valuable, but the cover letter needs to reflect what exactly is it that this work offers to the body or the scientific literature out there. And again, explain why the work is appropriate for the readership of that journal, right? If, say, ACS Central Science, in this specific sample, they're very interested in a broad audience because this particular work touched an evolution and it has organic catalysis, biocatalysis, chemical synthesis. So maybe all these different communities will be interested in this particular work. So always make sure that that those 2 points are addressed in the cover letter. And again, as a rule of thumb, you don't want this letter to be any longer than maybe 1 page. And that's it. I mean, you did all the hard work. I mean, you put lots of care in drafting a compelling title, a good abstract. Your images look beautiful. You drafted a very strong cover letter. Well, now it is time to submit, right? So here it's a very good sort of checklist to have available at the time of submission. Just make sure that you do have a cover letter. Obviously, the body of the manuscript file, the supporting information, the author names and contact information, and many journals even sometimes require, but some journals allow you to make suggestions of reviewers. Obviously, just make sure that you avoid a friend of yours or people with a conflict of interest. Really, people that are experts in the field and that will provide a valuable opinion on your manuscript. So those are always things important to consider. And with that, I believe that I'm done. And well, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your attention. And I believe, I don't know how we're going to do this, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much. So I want to check with Luan if we have some question. Luan? I think you are mute. Yeah.
Pessoal, se vocês tiverem dúvidas, vocês podem colocar no chat, tá? Que a gente ajuda aqui, a Regina ajuda a traduzir, a gente vai dar pergunta do Dr. Carlos.
Sim, com certeza. Enquanto isso, eu tenho um comentário, na verdade. So, Carlos, a common question that we always get from students, it's about self citation or they ask, like, you talk a little bit about reusing like figures and these kind of things. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know ACS use these reports about copyrights and everything. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So what is it? It's you have to be careful, right? So there are tools that we have available in our system to check for potential plagiarism. So when the paper is submitted and is going through the process, we have the ability to run that manuscript through that plagiarism check. And if there is certain threshold in which we find text that has been used before, the system will kind of pick that up and flag it as a potential ethical violation, right? Because there is too much overlap with previous text. That includes your own text.
Yeah.
So you want to be careful about that. I mean, it's called self-plagiarism, and the fact is that once the paper is submitted and published in the journal, basically now the publisher has the copyright of that content. So even though that is you wrote that paper, technically you need permission to reuse that text. So always make an effort, even if it is your own writing, to put it in different words. Editors tend to understand, for example, if the experimental part of a paper is very similar. Well, that's the way you do the experiments, right? I mean, there are not 100 ways to rewrite how you did the experiment. So if the overlap is with the experimental part, editors tend to be okay letting that part to be quite similar to a previous paper. But as much as possible, just try to avoid, taking chunks of text from other papers. That's number one. I mean, it's basically plagiarism. Now, self-citation, I mean, you have to put your research in context, right? You don't want to oversell yourself. As I said, you want to give others that have done previous to your work the proper acknowledgement. So I think it's a fine balance, unless you are the only one working in the world in this field, which is probably not the case. I think you want to avoid excessive self-citation.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Carlos. So we got another question here, and the question is easier to get your manuscript accepted when your advisor is on the board of is like an editor of that journal? Like, they should look for a journal where the advisor is part of that, and this way maybe it's going to be easier to get the manuscript published.
It's a misconception, at least with the ACS journals. Even so, a detail that the community may not be aware of. If I were, I'm not a practicing scientist anymore, right? But so for people to understand the dynamics of the journals at ACS, I work for ACS, so I do have access to all the papers. I see all the submissions, but I do not make decisions, right? Our editors are practicing scientists, people that are in a laboratory doing experiments as everybody else. So basically, in 15 minutes, they put their editor hat and they do editing, and 10 minutes later, they have a student asking them about a paper they're writing, right? So they are authors themselves. So if they were to submit a paper, if an editor chooses to submit a paper to their own journal, the system automatically blocks them. This editor no longer have access to that paper. They don't see anything about peer review of that paper. That said, editors do get rejected. I mean, they're authors, right? Their papers are not always excellent. So the editors do get rejected. So all this to say that might be a misconception, at least at ACS journals. The fact that you publish with an editor doesn't mean you have a guaranteed paper accepted.
Yeah, and do you think there is like a ethical violation in here?
Yeah.
If you get accepted just because your advisor is there and not because of the quality of the paper. Okay. Let me see. I think we have one more question here. I cannot see this question, so small. Let me wear my glasses. Oh my goodness. What kind of okay, now it's bigger. What kind of information I have to put to the graphical abstract? I think the TOC, right?
Yeah.
I understood that I have to resume my work, but what's necessary to be in the graphic?
So the first thing about graphical abstracts or TOC image, it has to be original. And what I mean by that is that, for example, let me just give you an example. You really like this other figure published in a paper, right? And you want to reuse that in your manuscript. It's fine because that figure will have a caption, and in the caption you can say published in name your journal, right? Whatever it is. In a graphical abstract, there is no caption. There is no way where you can put that image belongs to somebody else. So TOC images, they have to be original. Graphical abstracts, they have to be original. Having said that, this is me, and I will raise my hand there. I'm not much of an artist. That I was not born with that trait. But this is your one opportunity to express maybe the theme of the journal, right? I mean, the example that I put, I think it was photophysics of something green chemistry, green synthesis. So, right, I mean, there was water, there was light, there was some particles there. So you just gotta give the reader a taste for what the paper will be like. There is no really a recipe of what should be in it. This is your one chance to be creative. So yeah, I wish I had more to say. You just get to be artistic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of the first things that the readers is gonna see, right?
Yep.
So the image.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Luan, do we have some more questions?
I think not. So, Dr. Carlos, thank you so much for accepting the invitation for being here with us virtually in this year. But it's always a pleasure to have you with us, and I think this issue is very important for us in the post-graduation and for the undergraduate guys to start in the academic life. So thank you so much.
No, thank you to you, Luan and Reggiani, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure, and fingers crossed. Hopefully, it'll be face to face next year.
Yeah, we hope we can have you here again, Carlos, in Brazil.
No, thank you so much again. Always a pleasure.
Regiane, muito obrigado pela sua presença, para ajudar a gente a entrar em contato com o Carlos e mediar esse encontro. Eu vou falar, está sendo redundante, mas a gente fica muito feliz com a ajuda da CS e a gente espera manter essa relação por bastante tempo e que seja presencial ano que vem.
Esse é o nosso maior desejo, né? E eu também quero agradecer mais uma vez, dizer que para nós da ACS é sempre uma alegria ter a oportunidade de fazer parceria com a UFC, com o Chapter agora, pós-graduação que está sempre aberta também, e divulgar os nossos eventos. Então, muito obrigada, os agradecimentos são nossos. Muito obrigada.
Então, pessoal, muito obrigado para quem está presente aqui com a gente. Essa palestra vai ficar gravada, vocês podem ver depois, assim como a lista de frequência. Nos encontramos hoje novamente às 14 horas com o show de talentos, e dessa vez a gente teve todas essas palestras científicas, mas às 14 horas vai ser o show de talentos, tá? E a gente espera que vocês estejam aqui para presenciar nossos colegas que vão apresentar algumas coisas. Eu queria muito que vocês estivessem aqui. Quem quiser fazer alguma coisa ao vivo, alguma brincadeirinha, a gente vai ver se a gente consegue fazer essa interface. Vamos discutir isso, se vocês quiserem. Então, muito obrigado. E às 16 horas a gente tinha a palestra de encerramento, tá? A gente conta com todos vocês em mais um dia. Bom dia, até às 14 horas. Qualquer dúvida, a gente está no Instagram, a gente está nos e-mails. Certo, pessoal? Então, bom dia para vocês e até mais.